The street was a place where stories were woven in the fabric of everyday life, where the hustle of city dwellers met the stillness of the forgotten. For Marcus, the man on the corner, the street was both a sanctuary and a prison. It was where he had spent countless years of his life, watching the world rush by while he remained anchored in place. His clothes were faded and torn, the once vibrant colors now dulled by years of use and exposure. His shoes had holes in them, the soles worn thin from the countless miles he had walked in search of work, food, or just a kind word. His face, once young and hopeful, had become marked with the lines of struggle and regret. Marcus had never planned to end up here. It wasn't how he envisioned his life when he was younger, working as a mechanic and dreaming of opening his own garage. He had been content with his small apartment and a steady job that allowed him to live modestly, but with dignity. But life had a way of throwing curveballs, and his ability to weather the storm started to wear thin. His marriage fell apart, his savings disappeared with an unexpected medical emergency, and his addiction to alcohol took over, slowly pushing him further from the life he once had. Over the years, the streets had become his home. The once bustling city that he had known so well became a blur of indifferent faces. People avoided eye contact, their eyes glazed with the stress of their own lives, as if to look at him would somehow expose the fragility of their own existence. There were rare moments, though, when someone would stop. Maybe a kind passerby would offer $1, or an old acquaintance would stop to chat for a moment. But those moments were fleeting. Most of the time, Marcus found himself invisible, a forgotten soul wandering the concrete jungle, desperately hoping for a lifeline. On this particular day, Marcus stood at the intersection of two busy streets, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps." His eyes were tired, and his hands shook slightly from the cold wind that cut through his jacket. As the traffic moved in waves, he scanned the faces of the commuters as they zoomed past, lost in their own worlds. Some avoided his gaze, others glanced at him with a mixture of pity and indifference. Just as he had done countless times before, Marcus asked quietly, "Spare $1, please." He knew it was a long shot. Most people didn't even acknowledge him. He had grown accustomed to the hollow silence that followed his request. But this time, something was different. As he raised his eyes to look at the crowd passing by, his gaze met a familiar face. Stephen Curry, the NBA superstar, was walking down the street. Marcus recognized him instantly. Curry had become a hero in Oakland, not only for his remarkable basketball skills, but for his commitment to the community. He had raised millions for various local charities and often spoke out about social issues, using his platform for good. But to Marcus, Curry was more than just a basketball player. He was a symbol of everything he had lost: ambition, hope, and the belief that life could get better. For a moment, Marcus hesitated. The idea of asking someone like Curry for help seemed absurd. What could a man like that possibly see in him? But something inside him stirred. Maybe it was the desperation that had become a constant companion, or perhaps it was the flicker of hope that had been rekindled by the kindness of strangers in the past. Without thinking, he extended his hand and asked, "Excuse me, sir, could you spare $1?" Curry didn't immediately walk by, as Marcus had expected. Instead, he stopped. He looked at Marcus, his expression softening, and for a brief second, their eyes locked. Marcus had been on the streets long enough to recognize a moment of genuine human connection when he saw it. This wasn't the dismissive glance he had become so used to. There was something different about the way Curry was looking at him, as though he saw not a man down on his luck, but a person with potential, someone worth helping. Without a word, Curry reached into his pocket and pulled out a $100 bill. He placed it into Marcus's hand, but it wasn't just the money that left Marcus speechless. It was the way Curry's eyes held his, as if he were speaking without uttering a sound. Curry's voice broke the silence. "Take this," he said, his tone sincere, "but I want you to know something. You have more value than you think. Life doesn't have to stay this way. I believe in you." The words hit Marcus like a wave, knocking the breath from his chest. He looked down at the bill in his hand, hardly able to process what had just happened. $100 was more than enough to buy him food and maybe even a room for the night. But it wasn't just the money that had struck him, it was the belief that someone with everything to lose, had seen something in him. For a fleeting moment, Marcus felt seen. For the first time in years, someone had recognized his humanity. Curry didn't wait for a response. He gave Marcus a quick nod, then turned and continued walking down the street. Marcus stood frozen, still clutching the money in his hand, his mind reeling. It wasn't the first time he had been given money, but it was the first time he had been given hope, and that, more than anything, felt like the greatest gift of all. As Curry's figure disappeared into the crowd, Marcus stood there, not knowing what to do with himself. He looked at the bill in his hand again, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the message. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't a lost cause. Somewhere, someone still cared. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt that way. The realization hit him slowly but powerfully. Maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to stay this way. The world continued to move around him, cars honking, pedestrians rushing past, life going on as usual. But for Marcus, in that moment, everything had changed. Marcus had never been one to ask for much. On the streets, where survival was a day-to-day struggle, he had learned that people often ignored his presence, as if he were just a shadow among the concrete and glass. His daily routine was predictable, standing at the busy intersection, holding a cardboard sign that simply read, "Anything helps." The sign had become more than just a request for money. It had become a symbol of his brokenness, of the years he had spent wandering the city streets without any clear direction. The cold had set in early that year, and the air felt bitter as it swept through the bustling city. People passed by in a blur, too focused on their own lives to notice the man in the corner. Marcus had learned to be invisible. It was easier that way. Less disappointment when no one stopped, less resentment when no one cared. He'd come to accept that life had taken its toll on him, and he wasn't sure where it would lead. His past was a long string of bad decisions, each one compounding into the wreckage of his present. But in the depths of his struggle, there was one thing that had never wavered: hope. Hope, however small, was the only thing that kept him going, even when it seemed like the world had forgotten him. That afternoon, as the wind cut through his jacket and the traffic whizzed by, Marcus repeated his familiar line to anyone who would listen: "Spare a dollar, please." It was a plea that he had made countless times before, and just as many times it fell on deaf ears. He watched as people rushed past, their faces indifferent, their eyes avoiding him. And then, in the midst of the crowd, he saw him, Stephen Curry. Marcus had always admired Curry, not just for his skills on the basketball court, but for his humility and his dedication to giving back to the community. Curry was more than just a sports figure. He was a role model, someone who used his fame and fortune to make the world a better place. In a city like Oakland, where opportunity was often out of reach for many, Curry was a symbol of hope. He was someone who had made it, someone who had risen above the struggles of life. For a moment, Marcus couldn't believe his eyes. Was it really him? The unmistakable face, the familiar stride, yes, it was Curry, walking down the street, heading straight toward him. Marcus stood frozen, the thought of approaching the basketball star feeling absurd. What could a man like that possibly have to do with someone like him? After all, Marcus was just another face in the crowd, just another nameless figure asking for spare change. But something in Marcus stirred. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the unspoken understanding that this could be a chance to break free, a chance to be seen. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus called out, his voice shaking slightly. "Could you spare a dollar?" Curry slowed his pace and turned toward him. His expression softened as he met Marcus's gaze. There was no hesitation, no judgment in his eyes, just a simple, quiet understanding. Curry didn't say anything right away. He simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp, fresh $100 bill. The act was so sudden, so generous, that Marcus almost didn't register what was happening. "Here," Curry said, pressing the bill into Marcus's hand. "Take this. But I want you to know something: you have more value than you think. You're worth more than just this dollar. You deserve more." Marcus looked down at the bill in his hand, his heart racing. The world seemed to slow around him. $100. It was more than he had ever asked for, more than he could ever have hoped for. But it wasn't just the money that left him stunned, it was the words. The sincerity in Curry's voice, the belief that Marcus, a man who had been discarded by society, was worth something. For a moment, Marcus felt seen. Not just by a celebrity, but by a human being who recognized his humanity. Curry didn't linger. He smiled briefly, offering a nod before continuing on his way. But Marcus stood there, his hand still outstretched, the weight of the bill grounding him in the moment. His mind was spinning, trying to grasp what had just happened. This wasn't a random act of charity. It wasn't just a dollar. It was a message that he wasn't invisible, that his life still had potential, that he could still change, still fight for something better. As Curry disappeared into the crowd, Marcus's mind raced. He had spent so many years drifting, wondering if there was more to life than what he had known. He had heard stories of people overcoming their circumstances, stories of redemption and second chances, but they always seemed like distant dream stories meant for someone else, not for him. But now, in his hand, was proof that maybe, just maybe, he could have a second chance too. The money was more than just a means to survive, it was a lifeline. It was a symbol of possibility, of hope, of someone believing in him when the world had forgotten. Marcus stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to process the enormity of the moment. And in that moment, something shifted within him. He had always told himself that he wasn't worthy of a better life, that the choices he had made had sealed his fate. But Curry's act of kindness had sparked something deep inside him, a flicker of a dream he hadn't dared to dream in years. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he could turn things around. Maybe the future didn't have to look like the past. Marcus's eyes welled with tears, not out of sadness, but out of a deep, unshakable gratitude. He couldn't explain it, but in that brief exchange, in the space between the dollar and Curry's words, something had awakened inside him, a sense of worth, a belief that he could still make a difference in his own life. For the first time in years, Marcus didn't feel like just another homeless man on the streets. He felt like a person again, a person who could change his circumstances, someone who could rise above his past mistakes. The road ahead was uncertain, but in that moment Marcus knew one thing for sure: he had been given more than just a dollar. He had been given a dream. The days following the brief encounter with Stephen Curry passed in a blur for Marcus. He hadn't spent much time thinking about the money, though it was more than enough to get him through the week. What haunted him instead was Curry's words. "You're worth more than just this dollar." It was a phrase that echoed in his mind, replaying itself in every quiet moment. He hadn't been sure what to make of it at first, but over time, it started to grow on him. It was a challenge, not a pity. It made him question his own worth, his own potential. Could he really change? Was it possible to break out of the cycle that had trapped him for so many years? Marcus had spent so long accepting his circumstances as fate that the thought of transformation had never really seemed real. Sure, he had heard stories of people who had made dramatic comebacks, but those stories felt as distant and unreachable as the stars. He was just a homeless man, a shadow in the city's streets. He had no family to turn to, no educational skills that set him apart. His past had been marked by wrong turns, poor decisions, and a slow slide into the streets. But Curry's words stirred something deep within him, a flicker of hope, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. It wasn't long before Marcus's chance to truly reflect on his life and make a decision came. One morning, just a few days after the encounter, Marcus was doing his usual routine, sitting by the same street corner with his sign. The weather had turned, and the streets were bustling with the usual crowd of workers and tourists, too busy to notice the man sitting there with a cardboard sign asking for spare change. As the cars zoomed by, Marcus's mind wandered, thinking about the money he had received from Curry, thinking about his life, and then it happened. Out of nowhere, a familiar figure appeared on the sidewalk in front of him. It was Curry again. He wasn't expecting it. It was as if the moment from a few days ago had somehow looped back in time, a moment frozen in reality. Marcus looked up in disbelief, unsure if he was dreaming. But no, it was really him, walking toward him with purpose. "Hey man," Curry said with a warm smile, his presence as grounded as ever. "I've been thinking about what I said. I meant it. You have a lot of potential." Marcus, still taken aback, blinked and tried to gather himself. I didn't expect to see you again," he stammered. Curry chuckled lightly. "Yeah, I know. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be back here, but I've been thinking about you. I feel like you've got something in you, man. You're just in the wrong place, in the wrong situation. You deserve more than this." It was like Marcus had been punched in the chest. He had never heard someone speak to him this way, especially not a celebrity, a basketball star, someone with a life that seemed to have no connection to his own. Curry's words were raw, real, and full of conviction. For a moment, Marcus's voice caught in his throat. "What? What are you saying?" I'm saying I want to help, Curry said, his tone gentle but firm. I know I can't just give you $1 and expect things to change. It's bigger than that. I want to give you an opportunity, but it's up to you what you do with it. Marcus didn't know how to react. His mind raced, unable to comprehend the possibility that Stephen Curry, the same Curry who had just donated thousands to youth programs and worked tirelessly to better the community, was offering him a chance and opportunity. Was this real? Was he being pranked? Listen, man. Curry continued, I run a foundation. We focus on providing resources for people who've been through tough situations, people who want to get back on their feet. You don't have to be stuck here forever. We can help you find a job, get some education, whatever it is you need. But you have to be serious about it. I'm not offering you charity, I'm offering you a shot, a real shot to turn things around. Are you ready for that? Marcus's mind was still spinning. He had spent so many years getting by, existing, not truly living. He had survived, yes, but at what cost? And now, out of nowhere, a man who had everything who could give away millions without a second thought was offering him a chance. A chance to be something more than a man asking for spare change on the street. Why me? Marcus finally managed to ask, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. Why would you want to help someone like me? Curry paused for a moment, as if weighing the question carefully. Because I've been there, he said, his voice quieter now. Not exactly in your shoes, but I know what it's like to struggle, to feel like the world's against you. I know that feeling of being invisible, like you don't matter, and I don't want you to go through life thinking that's all there is. I see something in you. I think you've got the strength. You've just got to find it. Those words hit Marcus harder than anything he had heard in years. Someone saw him. Someone actually saw him. Not as a burden or a charity case, but as a person with potential. It wasn't the promise of a job or money that made his heart race. It was the idea of something bigger, of finally having a path, a reason to believe in something again. Take some time to think about it, Curry added, his tone soft but encouraging. You don't have to make any decisions right now, but I'm serious. This is an opportunity. If you want it, we'll make it happen. You deserve a future, man. And with that, Curry gave him a final nod and walked away, disappearing into the city streets once more. Marcus stood there for what seemed like an eternity, his heart pounding in his chest. The dollar, the brief conversation, it had all felt like a dream. But now, as the sounds of the city swirled around him, Marcus realized something. It wasn't just a dream. It was a turning point. A moment when someone had reached out to him, not out of pity, but out of a genuine desire to help him realize his potential. A moment when he had been offered the chance to finally live the life he had always dreamed of. The future wasn't guaranteed. The road ahead was unknown. But for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like he had an opportunity. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. In the weeks that followed, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his life was shifting, albeit slowly, beneath the surface. After Stephen Curry's offer, he took time to reflect. It felt surreal to even consider, but something inside him told him he had to take this chance. He had been stuck for so long, trapped in a cycle of poverty and despair. But now, for the first time, there was a flicker of hope, a possibility of change. Curry's foundation, which had been a beacon of hope for underprivileged communities, was offering him more than just financial aid. It was a chance to rewrite the story of his life. The program was designed not just to get people off the streets, but to help them rebuild their lives from the ground up. It focused on practical skills, education, and mental health support, things Marcus had never thought much about before. For him, survival had always been the priority, not self-improvement or growth. The first step in the process was enrollment in a personal development workshop. When Marcus showed up, he was nervous. He had never been part of something like this. The building was sleek and modern, far removed from the dingy shelters he was used to. Inside, a group of other individuals in similar circumstances had gathered, their faces a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Marcus felt a wave of doubt rise in him as he walked through the door. Could this really work? Was he just going to be another failure among so many others? But when the facilitator, a warm and approachable woman named Lisa, spoke, something shifted. She didn't just talk about success in abstract terms. She spoke from experience. She had worked with people like Marcus before, people who had fallen through the cracks, people who had given up on themselves. She had seen them turn their lives around, and she knew the process wasn't easy. It was a journey, a long one, filled with setbacks and moments of doubt. But it was possible, and that possibility gave Marcus something to hold on to. The first lesson was about setting goals. Lisa didn't ask them to change everything at once. She didn't promise them a miraculous overnight transformation. Instead, she asked them to identify one small, achievable goal, something they could work on every day. For Marcus, it seemed so simple. He wanted to get clean. For years, he had used alcohol and drugs to numb the pain of his circumstances, to escape from the crushing weight of shame and hopelessness. But deep down, he knew it was time to stop running from himself. He started with the basics, getting into a routine. For the first time in a long time, he woke up every morning with a purpose. The program provided access to mental health support, and Marcus was introduced to a counselor who helped him work through his past traumas. It wasn't easy. There were days when he felt like he couldn't face it all. But each small victory gave him strength. When he stayed sober for a week, when he attended all his therapy sessions, when he began learning basic job skills. These moments, though small, were his first steps towards a new future. One of the most surprising things about the program was the community that formed around it. There was a camaraderie between participants. Many of them had been in Marcus's shoes at one point or another. They understood the feeling of being invisible, of walking through life as if nothing mattered. They understood how hard it was to trust others, to trust themselves. But in this group, that trust slowly began to form. They supported each other, not just as strangers but as fellow human beings on the same path. They shared stories of struggle and triumph, of dreams long buried but never fully extinguished. As the weeks went by, Marcus began to see changes in himself. His mind was clearer, his body stronger. He felt a renewed sense of hope, but he also felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of pride. He had begun to believe that he deserved more than the life he had been living. The once distant future now felt like something he could reach, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, and there would be moments when he questioned his decision to leave the streets behind. However, the foundation was there. He had a new support system, a new sense of purpose, and above all, he had a chance to take control of his own life. One evening, as Marcus sat in the center of a group therapy session, Lisa asked everyone to share something they were proud of. The room went silent for a moment as people thought about what to say. When it was Marcus's turn, he hesitated. What had he done that was worth being proud of? He had been homeless, an addict, a failure. But then he remembered something. "I've been sober for 3 weeks," he said, his voice shaky but steady. "I never thought I'd be able to say that, but here I am." The room erupted in applause. It wasn't just the 3 weeks of sobriety that mattered. It was the recognition of the effort, the recognition of the change that had already begun, and that recognition coming from others who truly understood was what gave Marcus the courage to continue. The transformation wasn't overnight. It wasn't some fairy tale where the world suddenly became perfect, but it was real. Marcus knew he was no longer the same man who had sat on that street corner, asking for spare change. He was learning to be someone who could offer something back to the world. The program didn't just give him skills, it gave him a new way of seeing himself. It gave him hope, something he had almost forgotten how to feel. Marcus wasn't sure where the road would lead. He knew there would still be struggles, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a future. And that future, no matter how uncertain, was his to build. The journey from despair to redemption is rarely smooth, and Marcus learned this truth early in his recovery. At first, the new life that was promised to him through Curry's foundation felt like a dream. Each day, he woke up with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to push forward. But as time passed, he encountered the harsh realities of change, moments of weakness, temptations, and the nagging voice of self-doubt that threatened to pull him back to his old life. The first few months were a mixture of small triumphs and difficult setbacks. Marcus stayed sober, but it wasn't easy. He had moments where the temptation to drink, to escape from the painful memories of his past, felt overwhelming. He'd walk down the street, passing bars and liquor stores, and the old urges would creep in, whispering that one drink wouldn't hurt, that he deserved it after everything he had been through. But he didn't give in. He remembered his goals, the promises he made to himself, and the support system that had rallied behind him. It wasn't just about him anymore. He realized that his recovery was bigger than his own struggle. He had a responsibility to the people who believed in him. Workshops, therapy sessions, and job training courses filled his days, and Marcus threw himself into them with everything he had. He knew that to make a real change in his life, he had to put in the effort. At first, the job training felt foreign to him. He had no skills, no experience to speak of. His past had been spent on the streets, not in offices or workshops, and the thought of learning how to use a computer or interview for a job seemed intimidating. But Marcus didn't give up. Each small step felt like a victory, learning how to write a resume, making it through mock job interviews, and most importantly, finding a way to believe that he deserved to succeed. But even as he worked hard to rebuild his life, there were moments that tested his resolve. There were days when he felt like a failure, when it seemed like progress was slow or non-existent. He'd see others around him getting hired, moving forward faster, and wonder why it was taking him so long. It was hard not to compare himself to them, to feel that familiar sting of inadequacy. But Marcus learned something crucial in those moments. He learned that progress isn't always linear. Some days you take 2 steps forward, other days you take 1 step back. The key wasn't how quickly he was moving, it was the simple act of continuing to move. One evening, Marcus found himself sitting in a group session, listening to others share their struggles. He felt the weight of his past, the years he had wasted, and he wondered if it was even possible to make up for lost time. But then, a woman in the group, who had been clean for 5 months, shared her story. She spoke about the constant battle to stay sober, the sacrifices she had made, and how, despite everything, she was proud of how far she had come. Her words hit Marcus like a lightning bolt. He realized then that the road to redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about building a new future, one choice at a time. Her story gave him the strength to stop focusing on what he hadn't done and instead appreciate what he had accomplished. The turning point came one rainy afternoon when Marcus was assigned his first real job through the foundation. It wasn't glamorous. He was tasked with cleaning up a local community center, but for Marcus, it was everything. It was his chance to prove to himself that he could hold down a job, that he could be dependable, and that he could make an honest living. At first, he was anxious. He'd never had a job where he wasn't constantly looking over his shoulder, afraid of being caught or fired. But the community center was different. The people there welcomed him, treated him with respect, and showed him that hard work didn't go unnoticed. The satisfaction of a job well done, the feeling of having a purpose, was something he had never experienced before. It was simple work, but it was a foundation on which he could build the rest of his life. As the months passed, Marcus's confidence grew. He began taking on more responsibilities at the community center and even started taking courses on financial literacy and basic office skills. There were still tough days, moments when he wanted to give up, but Marcus remembered why he was doing this. He thought about the dollar Curry had given him on that fateful day, the promise of a future that was no longer out of reach, and the sense of pride that came with each accomplishment, no matter how small. One evening, as Marcus walked home from the center, he reflected on the long road he had traveled. He passed the same streets that had once been his home, the corners where he'd begged for change, the alleyways where he'd hidden from the world. The contrast was jarring. He had come so far, and yet there was still so much more to do. But for the first time, he didn't feel defeated. He felt empowered. He was finally in control of his own destiny. Marcus knew that the journey wasn't over. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a continuous process of self-discovery and growth. There would be setbacks, days of frustration, and moments when he would question everything. But now he had the tools, the support, and most importantly, the belief in himself to keep going. Hard work, progress, and the will to change had become his guiding lights. He was no longer the man who had wandered the streets, lost in the darkness. He was someone who had found his way out, one small step at a time. And as Marcus looked to the future, he knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he had already begun the most important journey of all, the journey of becoming the man he was always meant to be. Marcus had never imagined that his life could be different, let alone better. For so long, the streets had been his only reality. They were both his prison and his home, a place where survival was the only goal. But now, as he stood at the threshold of a new chapter, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the life that awaited him, one he had never thought possible. The transition from homelessness to stability wasn't as simple as just finding a roof over his head. It was about shedding the weight of years spent struggling to survive, confronting the habits and thoughts that had kept him trapped in a cycle of despair. Marcus found that the hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort of being on the streets, it was the mental toll it took, the belief that he wasn't worthy of anything better. This belief had been instilled in him over years of rejection, addiction, and hopelessness. But with each passing day, as he worked harder, took responsibility for his actions, and started rebuilding his sense of self, that belief began to change. At first, he struggled with the small things: making his bed, keeping his living space clean, sticking to a routine. These were habits that he had never cultivated during his years of wandering, and it often felt like he was learning how to be a person all over again. But he kept at it. The simple act of washing his clothes and folding them neatly gave him a sense of order in a world that had been chaotic for so long. Each day, he grew more accustomed to the rhythms of normal life, and in doing so, he began to trust himself again. Marcus's journey wasn't just about physical recovery, it was about the emotional and psychological shift that had to take place. He'd spent so much of his life fighting against the world, seeing himself as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in any place that offered warmth, opportunity, or connection. But as he built relationships with the people in his life, particularly with those who had been part of Curry's program, Marcus began to see that he wasn't alone. He wasn't an outsider. He was a man with a future, with the potential for more than just survival. With each step forward, Marcus found himself drawn to helping others. He became involved in outreach programs, visiting shelters and speaking to others who were still trapped in the same cycle of addiction and despair that he had once known too well. His story, once one of failure, had transformed into one of hope. He understood now that his struggles weren't in vain, they were the very things that had prepared him for the work he was doing now. He was proof that change was possible, that a life could be rebuilt from nothing. As time went on, Marcus started thinking about his dreams he had long buried beneath the weight of his circumstances. He wanted to help more people. He wanted to create a space where others could find the hope that had saved him. And while he knew it would take time, Marcus was determined to pursue these dreams. His new life wasn't about wealth or status, it was about making a difference, about paying forward the gift of transformation that had been given to him. Every step he took away from the streets felt like a small victory, but he knew the true test would be how he lived in the years to come. Marcus had come to realize that no matter how far he moved from his past, it would always be a part of him, a reminder of where he had come from and the strength it had taken to leave it behind. But as he looked toward the future, there was no fear. There was only hope, because Marcus had learned that the road to redemption isn't a straight line. It's a winding path, full of twists and turns, but with each step you get closer to the person you were always meant to be.